You and I both right now are using the laws of logic to interact with and have a conversation with one another. The law of non-contradiction says that A cannot be both A and non-A at the same time and in the same way. What that means is we can't contradict ourselves and something be true when we make a statement. So we can't say that, you know, Alan is Alan and Alan is Dustin at the same time and in the same sense. That's just a logical impossibility. Now, the laws of logic are immaterial. They're universal, meaning they apply to all people, all places, all times. They are conceptual and abstract. You can't serve somebody a bucket of the law of non-contradiction. You can't serve logic light at parties to your friends. You can't inject the law of identity into someone's veins. It's immaterial. And so it's not subject to empirical investigation, but it's necessarily true. It holds, it is the case, and in order to deny the law of non-contradiction, we have to use it to deny it. And so what I'm saying is that the Christian worldview is the only worldview that can make sense out of the very things that you and I are using right now to have a discussion about the beginning of the universe, to interact with and have a conversation with one another, and how that demonstrates the existence of God. God necessarily exists to make sense out of even your reasoning processes. Here's how. Logic is propositional in nature. You can write it on a board. It can exist in your mind as a mental proposition. Now, the laws of logic are immaterial. It can also exist in mathematical form in a symbolic notation. Those are all propositions. Propositions have meaning. Propositions exist in minds. You can write it on a board. It can also exist in mathematical form in a symbolic notation. Those are all propositions. Propositions have meaning. The logic as a proposition, it can exist mentally, and it exists necessarily, meaning that it exists universally. Logic necessarily exists both here on planet Earth and at the edge of the universe. It exists on Mars. It exists behind Europa. Logic necessarily holds everywhere we go, but logic exists propositionally. Since logic exists propositionally and necessarily, logic can only be contained in a universal mind, because propositions can only be contained in minds. It exists on Mars. It exists behind Europa. Therefore, the only mind that fits the criteria of a universal mind is God's mind. Therefore, logic is divine thoughts. If divine thoughts exist, then God exists. Therefore, God exists. That's an argument for God from logic. Logic necessarily requires the existence of an immaterial, transcendent, sovereign, universal God. Universal God. the only mind that fits the criteria of a universal mind is God's mind. And so the very rules and principles of reasoning that we use to talk with each other right now can only be made sense out of if God first exists to make sense out of those principles. Same goes with evolution. I mean, if evolution were true, and I don't think that scientifically it is, but if it were true, it would require God, because the principle of induction all of science is based on the principle of induction, that the future is going to be like the past. Okay, that's what the uniformity of nature is based on. That's the only way that evolutionary theory can happen, is that the present is the key to the past, that the same processes that we see happening now, natural selection, point mutation, lateral gene transfer, all that complicated biological stuff, is the engine that drives evolution, right? Over millions and even billions of years. Well, that requires the uniformity of nature. And we depend upon the principle of induction. Induction says the future is going to be like the past. But when somebody says that the future is going to be like the past because it's always been that way in the past, they're begging the question. They're assuming the future is going to be like the past because it's always been that way in the past. And atheist Bertrand Russell and skeptic David Hume pointed out that this is one of the most basic logical fallacies. You're assuming that the future is going to be like the past to prove that it's going to be like the past. That's called the problem of induction. It's never been solved in philosophy. But it is solved if you begin with God, because the God of the Bible says that God's going to uphold a general uniformity to nature. The nature is going to operate in a uniform and a law-like way in a general sense in order that redemptive history can be played out so that we can have this conversation that's ultimately going to point to Jesus Christ and our need for forgiveness and reconciliation with Him.